Chapter 10, The Turnaround Dance. Cookie Davis, Cape Porpoise, Maine. He was born Coleman Davis in 1951 in the local hospital not far from where he has lived his entire life. He grew up with the nickname Cookie, though no one really knew why people called him that. During the time that I spent with him, actually, there was some confusion as to what I was to call him. It all began with Miriam and me in front of his house waiting for him to answer the doorbell. As we stood there in the August humidity, Miriam complicated matters. "I still call him Cookie," she said, "and he hasn't complained yet, but he might want new people to use his new name. And he said something to me recently about changing his name to Dominique. And then he went on to list 5 middle names." This profusion of names did not strike Miriam as odd, just part of the package. "I mean, this cat has 10 names," she said. 10, I would learn later, was a slight overstatement. The feline in question was, in fact, named Wolfgang Amadeus Gauguin London. That day I spent with Cookie was clear and blue like a 19th century landscape painting of coastal Maine. That morning, I had followed Miriam to Cookie's house in Cape Porpoise. The tourists and summer residents were out like locusts escaping the August heat. The roads were crowded with Volvos, Sunburns, and New York and Boston accents. Miriam had described Cookie's house to me as a shack with no running water. Cookie, age 52 at the time of our interview, had lived in this house for his entire life. Cookie's father had died of a heart attack when Cookie was a kid, and his mom, Viola, passed away in 1998 of an aggressive breast cancer. According to local legend, Cookie had been strangled by his umbilical cord during delivery. This had resulted in some sort of brain damage, but this may have been a local myth perpetuated to explain Cookie's behavior. The story of his birth was never actually confirmed by Cookie. Miriam doesn't buy the idea that he is developmentally delayed or has any type of brain damage, but she does acknowledge that Cookie, who often dresses in women's clothes, marches to the beat of a different drummer. "I'm not sure if we do understand Cookie," she wrote to me later. "He is very contradictory in many ways. He doesn't really seem mentally delayed to me, but it's more like he's in a parallel state of consciousness." Cookie's mom had left him the deed to her house, ensuring him a place to live for the rest of his life. The town has always rallied to support Cookie. The managers of the Cape Porpoise Pier hired him to work in the bait shed for the lobstermen. Over the years, Cookie came with many interesting enterprises. One year he created homemade Christmas wreaths, and friends and neighbors have always bought whatever he's selling. Miriam told me that beyond this, Cookie lived on state aid and handouts, as well as money from collecting returnables, running errands for local restaurants, and income from his paintings. The town of Kennebunkport does not collect taxes on Cookie's property, and many assume it is planning to lay claim to this land once he's dead. The official Kennebunkport town government still holds to old-fashioned Maine values, which include protecting the underdog, Miriam said. Through most of the years of Cookie's life, Kennebunk has remained the type of small town that used to constitute American life, a place that took care of its own. But Miriam and others I spoke with said things are changing. Kennebunkport is now an outer edge bedroom community for Boston. It's also close to Portland and has become a popular retirement destination. Kennebunkport's population has increased dramatically in the past decade. According to Miriam and others, the entire area has become yuppified. Real estate prices have soared, and expensive homes now outnumber the older cottages. Out of the 30 or so homes on Langsford Road, where my husband's parents live, Miriam said to me, almost all of them have been bought by out-of-state new residents. These changes have affected the town's sense of community, according to Miriam. Whereas you used to recognize and speak to almost everyone you saw wherever you went in town, now More people are strangers to you than friends. Because the town has grown so rapidly, the sense of community has eroded. There is a clear sense of the little guy being pushed out of the way by the rich. Especially, I assume, if the little guy is not particularly prosperous and is a little bit different. The erosion of community is, in fact, an epidemic in the United States. Robert Putnam, a Harvard professor and the author of Bowling Alone, a popular academic book, has documented this sad phenomenon. Americans, he writes, are in general less engaged in such activities as civic organizations, social clubs, and local institutions of every stripe. The decline has many roots, from suburban sprawl to individual financial pressures, changing workforce dynamics, and the advent of modern entertainment, including the internet. Putnam, like many others, argues that this transformation is one of the most significant challenges facing the United States. The decline in community has significant consequences for both the public and for the individuals. According to Putnam, an impressive and growing body of research suggests that the civic connection helps make us healthy, wealthy, and wise. Individuals engaged in the concerns and activities of the community become more tolerant, less cynical, and more emphatic to the misfortunes of others. I wondered, standing in front of Cookie's home, if a less community-minded America will still have a place for people like Cookie. "Hey, Cookie!" Miriam yelled as she banged on his door. She'd given up on the bell. "Just a minute," came a response finally from deep in the shack. It was almost impossible for me to understand what this voice was saying. Cookie's speech, I would learn later, reflected the colorful, indigenous accent of rural Maine, one of the last strong regional accents in the country. His appearance, however, didn't quite jibe with what I'd heard. Cookie finally answered the door, wearing a pink bathrobe and a wig. He didn't greet me, but just pointed out toward his barn, which he had painted, and said, "I'll give you that one for $100. I really didn't register what Cookie was saying. I was trying to get my mind around his appearance. His head almost touched the roof of his house. He was tall, huge, maybe over 6'5". He was one of those people who go through life walking into rooms that were too small for them and trying on shirts with cuffs that were too short, ending in the middle of their forearms. He had blue eyes with a speck of black, and his face was deeply lined. He had the hands and arms of someone who had worked on the docks for years, and the veins on his forearms bulged like a bodybuilder's. But these strong, hard-working hands were clutching that lovely bathrobe. He appeared to have makeup on as well. Cookie, it seemed, was beyond any of the stereotypes that I would have used to categorize him. Was Cookie an old-time Mainer? Was he a cross-dresser, a drag queen? Was he the town eccentric? Or was he just a man who had a fondness of pastels? And how did a town that was all about overalls, jeans, and chinos accept a giant ex-fisherman who habitually dressed in a pink bathrobe? The place to start with all these questions was with a tour of Cookie's house. So after a few pleasantries and a quick goodbye to Miriam, whose hair, Cookie said, looked a little frizzy, we got started. I had been given countless house tours on this trip thus far, but needless to say, Cookie's was a little different from the others. It is not a nice house, Cookie said as we walked in, but I love it. I keep it clean. That much was true within reason. I shake the rugs out every day, he said with a proud smile. The layout of Cookie's home was such that with one pivot of his large feet, he could point to the kitchen, bathroom, bedroom, and the living room. As Cookie talked, his words punctuated by the sound of his shifting feet and sand on linoleum, I became intrigued by his manner of speech, deep and beautiful. It sounded like the linguistic equivalent of a shore with jagged rocks, still pools, and rocky beaches. Cookie's cadence was as erratic as a twisting shoreline, and his voice rose from a whisper to a rant with nothing in between. All in all, though, he had an amazing verbal confidence for someone who had rarely ventured far from his shack. Cookie's sense of decor was also a study in extremes. On one hand, his house was filled with images of local landmarks and points of interest, like a grandmother's house. There were watercolors, oil paintings, and pastoral calendars depicting a local church, an island off the coast of Portland, and a lighthouse in the fog. On the other hand, juxtaposed against these pastoral paintings was what many might consider a respectable amount of pornography of a European persuasion. Now, don't get me wrong, none of this was in any way grotesque or illegal, and the amount was nothing more than a married man might stash in the basement of his house, in his home, in an American suburb. What was of note about Cookie's taste in porno was that all the pictures depicted some form of gender bending. "I'm writing a book," Cookie told me in the middle of his house tour, briefly turning my attention from his decorations. "Great," I said. "Can you show it to me?" Cookie did not need to be asked twice. He disappeared into the other room and then came back carrying a book of colored paper. He smiled broadly. "I've just started. This book is about my struggles and my transition," he said. I knew that transition was a word used by those considering sex reassignment. Cookie had not made such progress beyond the title page of his opus, but that was all I needed to see. Here was the remarkable appellation that Miriam had alluded to early in the day. The author of the book was Dominique, Helen Louise, Emmanuelle, Victoria, Heather, Renee, De Janeiro, London. "All of these?" I asked. "These are all your names?" He nodded. "How did you come up with this?" I asked. "Just fooling around," he said. "It's a mouthful," I said in a rare, restrained moment. I started to say the names and he joined in, and we said in unison, Dominique, Helen, Louise, Emmanuelle, Victoria, Heather, Renee, De Janeiro, London. Then he repeated, "This book is about my struggles and my transition." Perhaps there was just a tad more to Cookie's story than I originally thought. "So," I said, "what could I call you throughout the day?" He didn't answer right then. Later, when I asked him the same question, he gazed at me and responded in a tone somewhere between a joke and a confession. "Dominique? Cookie? You can call me anything you want." Then he added, "Just don't call me late for dinner." Any attempt to try to understand Cookie's life must start with an exploration of how he was treated in his earliest years. Like many of the interesting people I've gotten to know, Cookie was still affected by old memories and hurts. The past was still very much with him. Throughout our day together, he would mention a teacher who demeaned him, a group of kids who tormented him, and his experience of being labeled slow. Gradually, he confessed that he was often called stupid and ultimately mentally retarded. Cookie grew up in the 1950s, a time of massive cultural optimism, social change, and institutional conformity. From what I can gather, he was never able to fit in or conform to our culture's cognitive norms. I asked him what it was like growing up in his conservative small town, given who he was. "Not that good," he said. "I had troubles. The kids made fun of me. The way I speak, the way I act, the harassment Cookie suffered was actually more than making fun, more than what we commonly write off as teasing. For Cookie, it was a kind of violence, attacks with lasting psychological repercussions. One day after school, Cookie was chased and attacked by a group of kids whom he described as a faceless mob. Being chased was nothing new for Cookie. This group of kids often walk a few steps behind him, shouting taunts like retard and fag. Some days they would just eventually stop. On other days, they would pick up the pace and start coming after him. Cookie, who was terrified, would run faster and faster, filled with terror, the kind of awful fear that only people who have been chased really understand. On the day, or days, of the attack, his pursuers caught Cookie and pelted him with rocks. Also omnipresent in Cookie's memory was a teacher named Nails. I called her Nails because she had long fingernails, Cookie said, which looked like claws. Cookie was plagued by a very specific memory of Nails dating back to when Cookie was 6. That day, Nails went too far. One of the students was doing work on the blackboard that Cookie just couldn't master. To remove himself from the situation, Cookie was watching the light outside the window filter its way through the bare trees. It was the dead of winter, and I imagined the light was the color of tarnished silver. I wasn't doing anything, and she just put her claws into me, Cookie told me. You got to get it right, Nails screamed at him. He said, I am trying. Then, according to Cookie, the teacher called him stupid. This label came as no surprise to him. He knew people called him that around his back, as he put it. If they said it to him directly, he always responded. He certainly responded to Nails. I said, no, I'm not stupid. And then I was out of control. I'll show you, bitch, he screamed at her. And that's when she dug her claws right in. Cookie pointed to his shoulder. According to him, Nails had dug her fingernails so deep into his shoulder until she drew blood. I just turned around and drew back, Cookie said. He punched her. I nailed her right on the jaw. It is still unclear to what extent Cookie was labeled at this point in his life as mentally retarded, but according to Carl Pippin, who went to school with Cookie and has known him his entire life, Cookie was always enrolled in some form of special education. His academic experience, specifically during high school, seemed to have been one of warehousing and social promotion. According to Cookie, when he was 17 years old, he was officially told he was retarded. They thought I was stupid, Cookie told me. I walked out. I told the doctors to fuck themselves. It is at this point that Cookie's story and my attempt to understand his experience merge with the social history of what used to be known as mental retardation, but it is currently referred to as a developmental disability. Before both of these terms came into use, however, such cognitive states were grouped under the heading feeble-mindedness. The history of these terms is not stable. Rather, their use provides a sort of loose history of how culture and society, to use a phrase coined by James Trent, a professor of sociology, invented the feeble mind. Most of us tend to think that what we call mental retardation is an objective phenomenon. In 1973, however, in one of the latest reshufflings of language, the American Association on Mental Deficiency changed the criterion for mental retardation from 1 to 2 standard deviations of normal IQ. In plain English, thousands of people earlier classified as mentally retarded woke up one day and were no longer retarded. According to Trent, the cognitive state that we've come to know as mental retardation or developmental disability was originally regarded as an expected part of rural and small-town life. Simpletons and fools were kindly regarded, even romanticized by the likes of William Wordsworth, and cared for by family members in the community. Trent convincingly argued that this rather accepting conception of cognitive minorities, while still at least a bit evident in some small towns around the United States today, changed in the 19th century when feeble-mindedness was invented and pathologized. In the 19th century, feeble-mindedness became a clinical category with individuals who were previously integrated into the community, now considered to be patients in need of rehabilitation. Influenced by pedagogical advances by French educators of the deaf and blind, a new class of training schools emerged. Their goal was to rehabilitate these lost souls and return them to the community. By the beginning of the 20th century, however, the goal of community integration had been nearly abandoned. In the mid-1900s, it was common for people of all political stripes to talk about menace of the feeble mind. Cognitive minorities were no longer gentle fools. They were dangerous and in need of total institutionalization. Coinciding with the rise in total institutionalization was an expanded clinical definition of mental deficiency. As a result of widespread intellectual testing in the Army during World War I, a new clinical taxonomy emerged that delineated discrete diagnoses such as idiots, imbeciles, and morons. The latter were of special concern to eugenicists because they looked and acted normal, but were degrading the country's gene pool. At one point, the Army's IQ testing suggested that almost 40% of the entire U.S. population were morons. In the 1950s, this elaborate system was abandoned, at least clinically. Yet, think how often people who are ignorant of their original meanings use words like idiot and moron in casual conversation. That decade, however, was a paradoxical time to be someone outside of our cognitive norms. A new lobby for middle-class parents advocated for those diagnosed as mentally retarded. This new lobby created the American Association for Retarded Children and moved the discourse away from inherited traits. Such people were not considered dangerous, per se, but were thought to be trapped in a perpetual childhood. Ironically, however, at a time when the social stigma of having a slow child was somewhat lifted, institutionalization continued at a brisk pace. Institutionalization is no longer the dominant social paradigm for people with developmental disabilities. What has replaced it is the rhetoric of community care, which emerged in the 1970s. Community care was a philosophy arguing that people with developmental disabilities were best served within their communities, not by large state-run institutions. Without question, empowering individuals to stay within their communities should be the ultimate goal of any public policy that concerns the lives of people like Cookie. But this notion has been co-opted by anti-big government politicians determined to decimate federal and state social service funding. Not surprisingly, community care initiatives have remained woefully underfunded. So what did we learn from our short history of the feeble-minded? If the social history of mental retardation is a story of shifting realities, one thing has not changed at all. Cognitive minorities are still one of the most socially and economically marginalized groups in the United States. 80% and 90% humidity be damned. Cookie was determined to look good for the rest of our day together. Oh yeah, you'll see. I'm gonna wear my 6-inch heels, he said as we left his house and made our way to the bus. And they're white. I was drawn to Cookie, in large part because he was an artist. He was a painter. Our plan to pass the time was for him to paint a mural on the inside of the bus. He decided that he was going to render Goat Island and the surrounding bay. Goat Island sat in the bay outside of Cape Porpoise Harbor. The island was uninhabited and had only one structure, the historic lighthouse built in 1822. Cookie had seen this island almost every day of his life since he was a child. The way its rocky shore sat against the shallow bay was beautiful, he recalled. He said it was part of the body of Maine, a special place, and it was important that I had this image of it to take with me as I traveled. As Cookie began priming the white surface of the bus, I thought about his connection to and knowledge of the landscape of Maine. All of Cookie's paintings were grounded in deep feeling. that suggests the importance of place to the artist. Cookie knew the coast and the way it curved and dipped like he knew his own body. Cookie's paintings were a form of realism, not done with a flat, top-down perspective, like an aerial map. Each of his main paintings had a story within it, an implied narrative. In 2001, though, I had never met Cookie in person. I hired him through my friend Miriam to paint an old door. When the painting was finished, Miriam explained that according to Cookie, his scene on the door showed boats returning to port after an unsuccessful day at sea. Each boat had a name. Cookie knew the captain of each boat. He knew the exact catch of the day for each, the local gossip about the boats and crew, and all sorts of stories about the fishermen's families. To use a term from the writer William Least Heat Moon, Cookie's paintings were deep maps of Cookie's world. These deep maps and Cookie's creativity provided a different way to make sense of Cookie, a way quite different from labeling him retarded. Within the tradition of folk art, there is what is now called visionary, self-taught, or outsider art. Outsider or visionary art, the two terms are used interchangeably, is defined as art by individuals who live on the margins of society, minorities, people who are poor, or those with disabilities. Actually, most outsider artists fit into more than one of these groups. The artists are individuals, like Cookie, whose fame of the mind and reference is radical, deeply removed from the expectations and standards of others. Grandma Moses is perhaps one of the most famous of the outsider artists, but I knew that Cookie resented and resisted being compared to her. Someone in town once compared his painting to the work of Grandma Moses. Upon hearing this, Cookie stopped in his tracks, put down what he was carrying, and said, "I ain't no fucking Grandma Moses." It took a while for Cookie to emerge as the town's full-blown outsider artist. This is common to the stories of visionary artists. Very often, there is a considerable gestation period involved. Many do not paint or make any art until later in their adult lives, and most never make art professionally as a means of income. After graduating from high school, Cookie went to college. Where Cookie went to college, or if he ever finished, was never made clear to me. After college, he came to live with his mom, and he, like many locals, worked odd jobs in the fishing community. Cookie worked the chum shack on the pier. A shit job, he said. It meant basically a life of scooping out fish intestines and other dismembered fish parts used as lobster bait. Surprisingly, during this time, Cookie got married. His wife, Lisa, was a local woman who, according to townspeople, was gorgeous and looked like a model. Cookie was willing to share very little with me about his marriage. What I know is that Cookie and Lisa tied the knot in the early 90s in Australia and lived there together for 2 years. Lisa came from a wealthy family, as Cookie recalled. She was good. She was an artist. She loved to drink. She got herself smashed. The marriage did not last long. Cookie went mum again. When I raised the subject of their divorce, though, according to him, they were still friends. At about the same time as the divorce, Cookie's mom, Viola, became very ill. She was sick for a few years. Cookie loved his mom deeply, and by 1998 her body was ravaged by an aggressive cancer that metastasized pretty much everywhere it could. Cookie's mom was his life. He had never lived for long with anyone else. It was during this time of change, his mother's illness and his divorce, that Cookie started to paint. Cookie did not draw a direct line between what was happening during this time in his life and his painting. I don't know if he really knew why he started to paint or why he continued. He described painting in the language of compulsion, a very common way for artists to verbalize their feelings about their work. His style appeared almost fully formed from the beginning. The first things he painted were the storage sheds on the pier, and then the shed outside his house. From the beginning, Cookie's paintings portrayed his hometown and told stories. I wonder, though I never asked him, if his deep maps were a way to honor his mom. It is interesting to see them as testaments, testimonials, or memorials to a way of life that is now dying. Cookie's art was soon picked up by a local gallery in Kennebunkport, run by an entrepreneurial New Yorker. This man may have thought of Cookie's paintings in the outsider genre, or perhaps as pastoral Maine landscapes perfect for the tourist trade. Regardless, Cookie's work was suddenly hanging in a genuine art gallery, although it was a tough sell to the tourist market. Along with his landscapes, Cookie had developed an artistic fascination with rocks and naked women. His preference was to paint both at the same time. At one point, I was told, Cookie approached the gallery owner and asked if he could paint his pregnant wife naked, on some rocks, of course. Needless to say, Cookie's gallery representation was short-lived. Back in the bus, I asked Cookie what he thought about the comparison of his work to that of Grandma Moses. This time, he had a different, more refined response. I follow Monet and Gauguin and Rembrandt. He paused and motioned with his brush toward the mural he was painting. This is not folk art. It is retemperance, he said. Retemperance? I replied, suggesting the need for clarification. He pointed at his picture of Goat Island and then gestured beyond toward the small town center, past the chum shack, toward the Maine coast. He started to talk again about his art. It means thinking of a place and doing it, Cookie said, looking at him a little sad, and then added, so that's the whole thing, you know? In his own way, Cookie demanded to be seen as an artist without any qualifying labels. In many communities, people like Cookie are seen only through the lens of labels. They are considered sick. After World War II, American society began its economic shift from an industrial economy to a service economy. This brought an unprecedented rise in the social service economy. More shrinks, medical doctors, social workers, and educators. As John McKnight, a community activist and professor of public policy, wrote in his book, The Careless Society, this social service economy needs people like Cookie and its raw material. It needs a sick client. After painting for a few hours, Cookie took a break to have lunch with me. We sat in the humidity and ate deli sandwiches and talked about music and life in Kennebunkport. I mentioned to Cookie that I had some music. Classical? He asked. Oh, you like classical? I guessed. Medium rock, as they say, Cookie clarified. Like Metallica. I did not have any medium rock. I had few genres. All I have is pretty much just 80s music, I told him. 80s music? Cookie said, and put down his turkey sandwich, his eyes enlarged. I love the 80s music, he said emphatically. Cookie loved Duran Duran, Flock of Seagulls, Men at Work, Billy Ocean, and some band I had never heard of that he called ELO, Electric Light Orchestra. I just love the way they sing, he said. Then he looked at me very seriously and confessed, it's a great having people here to keep me company. Cookie's life had been lonely, but there had always been a core group of people who looked after him. Many of these folks were still around, but I was told that recently Cookie had begun to recede from his community. According to Miriam, Cookie had started to display what she called erratic behavior, beginning a few years around 2001. As we ate lunch and talked about music, Cookie addressed this change that people perceived in him, attributing it, at least partially, to the presence of so many new people around. They don't understand, he said, about the newcomers in his town, because of this stuff or that stuff, because when I have to go somewhere, I wear a dress. I really don't give a rat's ass. I don't care about the rat's ass. If I wear a dress, it's none of their business. The dress wasn't new to me. Miriam had told me that Cookie had an interesting style before I had met him. His ensemble included a blonde wig that he never washed but did cut and refashion into many interesting new hairdos. When Miriam asked him about it, he told her that it was a disguise, that he was hiding from a repo man who wanted to take his truck for late payment. The wig, I would learn from Cookie, actually had nothing to do with the repo man. It was the first step in resolving what Cookie called his situation. "This is true, the situation," he began, looking me directly in the eye. "The situation is the reason I want to change completely. The situation is the reason I want to become a woman." It seemed that the community of Kennebunkport was now being asked to empathize with someone a little more complex than the eccentric artist in drag. It was being asked to accommodate someone who challenged a basic norm of our society, the stability of gender. Cookie had been hinting all day that he wanted to actually become a woman, surgically. He was now starting to self-identify as transgendered. A transgendered individual is someone with a pervasive desire to change gender, often through surgical means. This is very different from someone who conceptualizes him or herself as or has been labeled a homosexual or engages in cross-dressing behaviors. A transgender person has a continuing desire to be a different gender. Questions about the causes of this intense feeling have no clear answers. Two broad explanations have been proposed, biological and psychological. Some psychologists assert that transgender behavior has a Freudian psychosexual basis, i.e., the bad mother messed up her kid. On the other hand, medical professionals assert a vague biological origin for transgender identities. Though certainly contentious in medical circles, many doctors prefer treatment for transgendered people in sexual reassignment surgery. Two interesting questions, for me at least, are how society has structured transgender desire over time and whether it is considered a real identity. The modern history of transgender begins in late 19th century Germany, where a group of doctors, influenced by a dominant European belief in a continuum of human sexualities and gender, applied a theory of natural human bisexuality to individuals who reported being trapped in bodies they considered incorrect. The more popular and widely disseminated history of transgender experience began in the United States, when an ex-Marine named George Jorgensen traveled to Europe in the 1950s and had sexual reassignment surgery. George became Christine, and she captured the public imagination and was obsessively covered by the press. Through this coverage, Jorgensen's story set the terms for the way that our culture understands transgender individuals, as well as the way that many trans individuals understand themselves. Jorgensen's story is filled with pervasive suffering and a vague realization that something was always wrong. Cookie told me a very similar story, describing his childhood as a time of gender confusion. He was a boy who thought of himself as daddy's little girl. "I always loved to play with girls," he said. "Even at 5 years old, it was just the way it was. I'm not ashamed of saying it. But it wasn't until later, when he was grown, that he, like many individuals in this situation, found the language to describe to himself his sense of suffering. I was watching the television documentary about where this guy turned into a woman. And the hell of it all is, here I had the same feeling for the past 50 years. That's how I found the proverbial needle in the haystack." Of course, most of the society sees Cookie's desire to change gender through the lens of sickness. According to the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, DSM, Cookie was gender dysmorphic disorder, or GDD. Like many diagnoses in the DSM and ADD to depression, GDD has a social history that has little to do with people's actual lives. Judith Butler, a gender theorist, asserts that GDD is just as politically correct way for shrinks to pathologize homosexuality, which was not fully demedicalized by the American Psychological Association until 1983. Many individuals who want to transform or are forced to use the official diagnosis to get treatment from doctors. Surgeons, for the most part, help people who are sick and have a disorder, not people who assert a fundamental right to determine their gender. Despite all the different ways to judge Cookie's gender bending, his goals are pretty simple and universal. After we finished lunch, Cookie looked at me and said, "My real dream is, after the whole situation is over, I want a nice, generous guy to just help me out and take good care of me and to love me." He then added, "And I would do 3 things. First, I would work somewhere. The second is have fun, and the rest of it." And here he paused and smiled. "The rest of it is I would find a nude beach where I could sunbathe naked. And believe me, I love sunbathing nude." "Okay, almost done," Cookie said as he put the final touches on his mural of Goat Island. He had recreated the entire scene from memory. I saw a picture of this island later, and Cookie did justice to the way the rock sat in the bay, alone, surrounded by shallow water. At that moment, a song by the Gap Band started playing on my stereo. "I love this!" Cookie screamed. It seemed that I had stumbled upon one of the few similarities between Cookie and Becky, my wife-to-be. They both had a passion for the Gap Band's "You Dropped a Bomb on Me." "I love that group," Cookie said. "I love that Gap Band because the Gap Band is really, to me, down to earth. They have the right beat." I looked at Cookie's mural and I saw off on the rocky shore one flower growing out of the rock close to the waterline. What would happen if the tide came in too far? Earlier, as Cookie started to paint that flower, I asked him why he chose to put it there, so close to the water. "Oh yeah," Cookie said, "I like flowers, just the way they are, the way they are, the way they project themselves as gorgeous, wild things." Cookie pointed at the mural ecstatically. "I'm gonna add one more thing you're going to love," he said. "Black buoy. Tells you where the rocks are." "I love the rocks," he added. I sat in the heat in the back of the bus and I admired Cookie's vision of the coast. "I like the little windmill on the top of the lighthouse too," I said. "Northerly wind coming in," he said as he pointed into a small rock somewhat like the place where he was born and made his life and remade his life. "Little lopsided, little house." "You think they use it anymore?" I asked him. Cookie nodded his head. "Oh yeah." It was almost 6 at night when Cookie finished painting Goat Island. Our day was almost over. All that was left were a few errands and a trip to the beach to watch the sunset. I had not gotten the answer to the question that had haunted me all day. Did Cookie still have a place in his community? Before we left, Cookie went back to the house to touch up his makeup, and I drove Bob Henry up a block and turned around in the cul-de-sac that led to the new condos near Cookie's house. The condos weren't done yet, and the ground was torn up. Its black underbelly was exposed to the sky. What would the people who lived there think of Cookie? They most likely would not be from the old Kennebunkport. They wouldn't have any memories or experiences that tie Cookie to their sense of self and sense of home. Cookie for them might not even be Cookie. They might never learn his name. In a place where old-fashioned ties have broken down, Cookie might just be the crazy guy down the street. He might be considered dangerous. Later, Cookie told me about the time when a man from what he called the committee came over to his house. According to Cookie, the committee came over sometime in 2001. He heard a knock on the door. When he answered it, he didn't recognize his caller. "You don't know me?" the person said. "I am on a committee. I'm asking you to leave town. We don't like your type." "What do you mean you don't like my type?" Cookie said. "Gender-wise," Cookie recalled the caller as saying, "you have to leave town or we are going to ruin your house." The next day, Cookie called a friend of his who was a town selectman. No one had heard about any committee, but according to Cookie, the person who came to his house may have been a developer. Later, Cookie said the man offered him money to move. Cookie, of course, turned him down. "They thought I was infected. I'm supposed to be gay and infected." We made our way downtown in 2 vehicles, with Cookie's truck leading the way. The sun had opened up the sky, as in one of Cookie's sea paintings. The trees moved in the wind. The road was choked with traffic, and a number of families were walking to the beach. They had the glow of wealth like models in a Ralph Lauren ad. As I followed Cookie, I thought about how gender and cognitive minorities are faced with violence every day. Small, cruel gestures and horrific violent crimes. Why should someone feel the need to police another person's body? Gender identity and sexual desire are multifaceted and varied, perhaps much more so than we realize. Intersexed individuals, for example, previously known as hermaphrodites, are much more common than the medical establishment leads us to believe. Throughout human history, almost every known culture has made space for the divergent human body. At the same time, gender variance has been violently suppressed. Perhaps our greatest acts of violence are reserved not for those experiences that are most foreign to us, but for those that are the closest to the truths about ourselves. But while I knew all of this intellectually, I was still deeply challenged by Cookie. As I drove, I remembered something Cookie had asked me when I first arrived. Before I went into his house, and he looked at me and said, "You're not going to make fun of me, are you?" At the time, I brushed it off, but Cookie had sensed something that I was afraid to admit. There was a time in my life where I would have made fun of Cookie. During my white hat days in high school, Cookie was resisting the idea of a settled, fixed self. He was asserting his right to change. Like most of us, though, my identity had been set for me. I might have made fun of Cookie before, but I would never know. I admired him. As we drove through town, however, I was filled with hopelessness about Cookie's future. A town of tourists, a community of summer residents cannot support people like Cookie, and his new focus on his gender issue may just be the straw that breaks the camel's back. He could end up destitute, in a home. Somehow one of these developers may convince enough people that he is infected. As I was having these thoughts, Cookie slowed down in front of me, pulling over to the side of the road and rolling down his window. He leaned his body across the passenger seat and ecstatically waved to a man who was walking down the street with his young daughter. The man stopped and faced Cookie, and then pulled his daughter closer to his side. He looked somewhat confused, and I braced for some sort of terrible hostile gesture, some sort of confrontation between two worlds. This man put his arms around his daughter, then spread his hand wide like a fan and waved to Cookie. His daughter waved as well. In something quite short of a Mainer accent, he yelled, "How you doing, Cook?" Cookie honked his horn and yelled back, "Just great, just great." I followed Cookie from there through the other side of town, tracking his blonde wig like a flashlight on a dark trail as it wove between European sports cars and t-shirt shops, lobster shacks, and old fishing piers melting into the ocean. Soon we found a place to sit on a point that jutted out into the ocean. The Bush family compound was off to the right, and the coast to our left. The Atlantic Ocean was spread out in front of us. Our day was just over. The sun was still high in the sky, but it was at that point where it was hard to tell whether it was going up or down. It just sat on the horizon as if it could stay there indefinitely. I didn't really know how to end my time with Cookie, so we just sat in silence until Cookie began to talk. Like I said, just take it easy with that painting. But put it this way, by the time you hit Reno, Nevada, it should be dry. He was referring to the mural of Goat Island he had done in the interior of the bus. This was his gift to me, and it was a chance to see a place through the eyes of someone who knew no other place, whose life was woven into the fabric of his community. I won't let anyone touch it, I told him. I would guard it with my life. Cookie then pointed to the bus. I don't think I would want to do that, he said, referring to the journey I was making. Why not? I asked. It would be a long haul, he replied. Take a lot of gas, and it'd be a long haul in a manner of speaking. Then he pointed out to the coast and the ocean and the town behind him. And I gotta stay here, he said. Cookie won't be made to leave any time soon. According to Miriam, there were still many old-timers left on the town council who would fight for Cookie. Why? Miriam and others looked at me funny when I asked that question. They shrugged their shoulders and just said some version of, that's what people do for other people here. Carl Pippin, who has known Cookie his whole life, called it good old organic care, the way it should be. It wasn't just the old-timers who fought for Cookie. I'd learned later that a fund had been created in Cookie's name by a group of realtors and an attorney. Many of these people had known Cookie for a long time, but some had not and were new to the community. The money was raised specifically to help pay off Cookie's back taxes in case the town decided to collect them, buy him a car, and fix his home. It was August 9th, in time for me to head home. From that day forward, I could be heading west again. It was the exact turning point, and it had been honored in some way. I got an idea here, I said to Cookie. Ever heard of a turnaround dance? There was no reason why he would have. Becky invented the turnaround dance, and it was pretty simple. Any time Becky and I were talking and we reached our turning point, we honored that turn with a dance. I explained this to Cookie, and he looked nervous. You don't have to worry about it. I'll do it. The turnaround dance doesn't have to be long, or good, or graceful, or anything at all. It just has to be done. The soundtrack dropped. The soundtrack for our turnaround dance was obvious. It had to be You Dropped a Bomb on Me. I walked back to the bus with Cookie and hooked up the stereo and rummaged around through my tapes. I looked at Cookie's mural in the bus. His name in the corner was smudged by the humidity of the day and my carelessness. I found the tape and set up the stereo. I stepped into the middle of a patch of dirt off to the side of the road. I tried to get Cookie's attention. I started to call out, Cookie, but then I stopped. I didn't know what to call him. Cookie? Dominique? Hey you? I was just as confused as when I had started, so I just started the tape. You don't have to do it, only if you want to do it, I said to Cookie, meaning the dance. I'll think about it, Cookie replied. I played the tape, and the Gap band shouted out toward the Bush compound and beyond. I closed my eyes and I turned my journey around. When I was finished, Cookie walked up to the dance without hesitation. Okay, he said. It was quite a sight. Cookie was framed by the Atlantic Ocean stretching out behind him. A 6'5", 52-year-old ex-lobster man, world traveler, master of the retemperance, transgender individual. I thought about his gender bending. Cookie is on the edge, as he has always been. The human form and experience is defined by variance. It seemed to me that it is only within the fabric of a community that this variance can thrive. It is only within the fabric of these relationships where Cookie can be Cookie until he decides she's Dominique. The Gap band blared out of the back of BH. Cookie put his arms out like John Travolta in Saturday Night Fever. He spun around and traced an invisible circle, Leonardo da Vinci's Perfect Human. A version of the Tibetan Buddhist conception of divinity as a woman and man fused together, violating all duality? No, just Cookie. Cookie danced an ungodly dance, fell over and laughed. "Oh, shit," he said. "Pretty good, huh?"